Hiya. I'm gonna cut this first bit out. I'm gonna scroll up, get back to my notes. Video. Recently, I had what was probably the most respectful conversation I've had online, but the most confusing conversation I've had online about homosexuality and Christianity combined. There wasn't any insults, no name calling was had, no one was told they were going to go to hell. They were just two Christians trying to understand scripture and explain their own different points of views. And honestly, I had a really good time in the conversation. I felt it was really useful, very helpful. But after reading the conversation back over, something did stand out to me. The other person did not argue from scripture. Instead, almost every argument rests on assumptions that were never actually demonstrated from the Bible itself. That's what this is about. Not attacking the person who I had a talk with, but examining the ideas, because ideas have consequences. Especially when those ideas determine whether or not people are told that the deepest relationship they'll ever have is fundamentally incompatible with God, and it's not true, and it hurts my heart to see. The mistranslation question. The conversation started with me saying that many passages traditionally understood to condemn homosexuality are disputed very strongly because the ancient world had no concept of homosexuality or sexual orientation. Immediately the response I was given, it isn't a translation. Notice something. That isn't an argument. That is just disagreement. If someone says a Greek word has multiple possible meanings, simply saying, no it doesn't really answer anything. You have to explain why. What did Paul mean? What did the Greeks actually say? What evidence do we have? None of that happened. Instead, the conversation immediately jumped somewhere else, to Sodom and Gomorrah. That's actually something you'll notice throughout this discussion. Whenever one point becomes difficult, another one appears. That's a pattern called moving the discussion rather than resolving the original claim. The first specific biblical example brought into the conversation was Sodom and Gomorrah. They responded to my argument about mistranslation, saying, it's not a mistranslation. Be so honest. Sodom and Gomorrah, multiple verses, question mark, talking to me like I've not read the fucking book. Sorry, I'm getting out of pocket. This is worth examining because Sodom has become so strongly associated with homosexuality that the English word sodomy was eventually derived from the city's name. But that later association cannot simply be projected backwards and treated as a self-evident meaning of Genesis 19. So let's have a look. The question is not what the word Sodom came to mean centuries later. The question is, what actually happens? Let's read our Bibles. Christians never do that. And before we even reach the mob outside of Lot's house, the story begins. Da-na-na-na-na. In Genesis 18, God tells Abraham, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous. Genesis 18:20 from the KJV. Sorry, I'm going to be reading this because it's got like all my things. I want to make sure I get them like word for word. This matters because God's judgment against the cities is already under consideration before this fucking mouse. Before the men of Sodom encounter the angels at Lot's house. The story doesn't say God discovered that some men in Sodom were attracted to other men and that they had a pride festival. Ooh la la, they're flamboyant and gay. It says that an enormous cry has risen from the cities because their sin was so exceedingly serious. That's a bad thing. The Hebrew Bible frequently uses the language of a cry for the desperate appeal of victims suffering violence or injustice. Within Genesis 18 itself, this follows a description of the way of God as doing justice and judgment. Genesis therefore frames it as the investigation of Sodom around systemic wickedness and injustice before it even describes the attempted assault in chapter 19. Abraham then bargains with God. He asks whether God will destroy the righteous alongside the wicked. He begins with finding 50 righteous people, works his way down to 10. God agrees the city will be spared if even 10 righteous people can be found. That establishes the scale of the accusation. This isn't a story about God spotting one isolated sexual offence. The narrative is presenting an entire society as violently corrupt. But we don't know about any of that because gay people were there. Immediately before the Sodom episode, Genesis 18 shows Abraham receiving 3 mysterious visitors. Abraham sees them, runs to meet them, bows, offers water, provides shade, and prepares an enormous meal. I need to go meet Abraham. Genesis then places Lot's reception of the angels directly beside Abraham's hospitality. Scholars have long observed that chapters 18 and 19 function as closely connected stories about the treatment of vulnerable strangers. Genesis 19 begins, "And there came 2 angels to Sodom at even, and Lot sat in the gate of Sodom." Genesis 19:1, KJV. Lot sees them, bows, and urges them to stay inside his home. The visitors initially say that they will sleep in the street. Lot insists that they come inside, feeds them, and gives them shelter. That detail becomes important almost immediately. Lot very apparently knows that strangers are not safe on the streets of Sodom. The contrast is deliberate. Abraham sees strangers and rushes to serve them, whereas Lot sees strangers and tries to protect them. The men of Sodom see strangers and surround the house. Now, here's what the mob actually demands. Genesis 19:4-5 says that before the visitors go to sleep, the house is surrounded by men of the city, described as including both young and old. They demand, "Where are the men which came in to thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them." Genesis 19:5, KJV. The Hebrew verb translated know is yada. It often means ordinary knowledge, but biblical context can give it a sexual meaning. There is no serious ambiguity about the meaning here because Lot immediately answers by offering his daughters, whom he describes as women who have not known men. The mob is demanding sexual access to Lot's guests. Describing that demand merely as same-sex sexual activity, like we've seen in this comment thread, strips away almost everything morally significant about the scene and indicates they did not really pay attention when they were trying to understand this verse. It isn't a date, it's not a relationship, it's not mutual attraction, it's not marriage, and it isn't even consensual sex. It is an armed, or at least physically threatening mob surrounding a private home and demanding 2 foreigners be surrendered for collective sexual abuse. Academic discussions of Genesis 19 regularly describe the threatened acts as sexual assault, domination, or abuse, rather than consensual homosexual relationship. So when this story is used against a loving gay couple, 2 completely moral categories are being collapsed into one. The only similarity is that the intended victims appear male. Everything else, the mob, coercion, violence, humiliation, xenophobia, and absence of consent, is ignored. That is a false equivalence. It treats men attempting to gang rape vulnerable strangers as being morally equivalent in the eyes of God to 2 adults freely entering a loving and faithful relationship that sometimes includes sex of the same sex variety. These aren't equivalent situations. Sexual violence in the biblical world is about power. In the ancient world specifically, rape was frequently used not merely for gratification, but to dominate, humiliate, and strip another person of social power. The threatened assault would therefore communicate, "These outsiders have no protection, no status, and no right to exist independently within our city." That is why reducing the episode to "men wanted men" or same-sex sexual conduct misses the narrative's central horror, and misses completely the moral lesson we're meant to learn from it. The mob is not asking whether the visitors share its sexual orientation, it's demonstrating complete control over outsiders. And the text reinforces this when Lot refuses. The mob turns on him and says, in effect, I'm not going to quote this one, "You came here as a foreigner and now you dare judge us?" Then they threaten to treat Lot worse than they intended to treat the visitors. That reaction reveals the issue clearly. Their anger is not that Lot has interfered with a consensual same-sex encounter. Their anger is that a resident alien has challenged their power and attempted to protect other outsiders. Lot offering his daughters does not make the scene less violent. Lot tells the mob, "Behold now, I have 2 daughters which have not known man. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you." Genesis 19:8 KJV. That's horrific. The fact the Bible records an action does not mean it's endorsed. Genesis repeatedly depicts deeply flawed people behaving terribly without stopping to issue a modern narrator's condemnation after every event. The whole point is that we are common sense people, we are intelligent humans, we should be able to look at something horrific and see what it is. Nothing about how Lot's offer shows. Lot's offer shows how extreme the ancient obligation to protect guests could be imagined, but it also exposes the brutality and patriarchy, put me my Claro on, of the world being depicted. Lot is willing to sacrifice his daughters to preserve the safety of the men under his roof. Nothing about that deserves romanticizing. But it does provide further contextual evidence. It does provide further contextual evidence that the scene concerns threatened rape. Yeah, same name, I guess. Lot offers female victims in place of male victims because he's trying to redirect the mob's sexual violence. The mob refuses. This means they only want men. Ooh, gay, gay, gay. Fuck off. That refusal does not turn its original demand into evidence about loving homosexuality. It shows that the mob specifically intends to dominate the visitors. Oh, kill myself. Blink, blink, blink. That refusal does not turn its original demand into evidence about loving homosexuality. It shows that the mob specifically intends to dominate the visitors whom Lot has placed under his protection. The parallel story in Judges removes any ambiguity. The clearest internal biblical comparison is Judges 19. A Levite and his concubine arrive in the Benjaminite city of town of Gibeah. Gibeah or Gibeah, pick your own. An old man takes them into his home. The men from the city then surround the house and demand, "Bring forth that man that came into thine house, that we may know him." Judges 19:22 KJV. The structure is unmistakably modelled on Genesis 19. Travellers enter a dangerous city, a host shelters them, local men surround the house, the mob demands the male guest, women are offered instead, the host pleads the men not commit this wickedness. It's slightly different though, because in Judges, the concubine is thrown outside. The mob rapes and abuses her throughout the night, and she dies. That parallel matters enormously. The attacker's behaviour in Judges is not presented as heterosexual romance. Ugh. In Judges, the concubine is ultimately thrown outside. The mob rapes and abuses her throughout the night, and she dies. The parallel matters enormously. The attacker's behaviour in Judges is not presented as heterosexual romance merely because the final victim is a woman. It is rape. Likewise, the intended attack in Genesis does not become homosexuality merely because the intended victim is a male. Both stories are about mob violence, sexual domination, the abuse of strangers, and the catastrophic failure of hospitality. Yale Bible Study identifies the close narrative relationship between Genesis and Judges 19. This is probably the strongest rebuttal to the simplistic reading of Sodom I was presented with. If you can even call it a reading, it was a reference. Like, what are we, a Marvel movie? The Bible itself gives us another version of the scene, and in that version, and in that version, the victim is female. The moral category remains sexual violence. Hospitality in the Bible. I'm reading out my chapter names. Calling this a violation of hospitality can sound oddly mild to a modern audience, as though Sodom's offence was failing to offer the angels a cuppa and a biscuit. But that isn't what biblical hospitality means. In a world without hotels, police protection, modern transport, or reliable public institutions, a traveller could be intensely vulnerable. Shelter could be a matter of survival, and once a host received the stranger, the host assumed a serious obligation to provide food, safety, and protection to that guest. Genesis 18 and 19 place radically different responses beside one another. Genesis 18 and 19 place radically different responses beside one another. Abraham uses his wealth to feed strangers abundantly. 1 second. Sorry guys, my anxiety pen. Sodom is wealthy, but uses its collective power to terrorize strangers. Lot offers shelter. The city attempts to invade that shelter and exalt his. Sodom. Where am I? Where am I on my page? The city attempts to invade that shelter and assault his guests. Hospitality here is not etiquette. The moral of the question is what a society does with people who arrive at status or power. Do you protect them, feed them, or do you exploit them? The story answers that question through a violent contrast. Scholarly discussion of these chapters commonly emphasizes the deliberate juxtaposition between Abraham and Lot's hospitality and Sodom's treatment of outsiders. This is where my original response was broadly right, although now I've fully read through most of Ezekiel, I would add a few more points. Other books in the Bible directly state that the sin of Sodom was pride and inhospitality. That's what I said. The clearest passage is Ezekiel 16:49 through 50. Behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom. Pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness was in her and in her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. And they were hefty, and committed abomination before me. Therefore I took them away as I saw good. Ezekiel 16:49 through 50, KJV. I always say that twice. Ezekiel identifies pride, material abundance, complacency, failure to assist the poor and needy, arrogance, and abomination. So I would adjust what I said, but I hit the broad strokes. So, big ups me, just pulling that from the old Nogarina. Ezekiel does not say that condom. Ezekiel does not say that Sodom committed only inhospitality. Verse 50 includes the broader word abomination, and traditional interpreters sometimes argue that this includes sexual sin. However, Ezekiel does not specify loving same-sex relationships that sometimes include sex. Its explicit description concerns a prosperous society that became arrogant and refused to support vulnerable people. That fits the social world depicted in Genesis 19. Powerful residents collectively preying upon people who lack protection. Some scholars can argue that the Hebrew word translated abomination, toeva, could echo the language of Leviticus and therefore remain a reference to prohibited sexual conduct. Others read it as a broad description of Sodom's many detestable actions. The responsible conclusion is not that Ezekiel omits every possible sexual element, because there were quite a few in that, but it directly prevents us from reducing it to just homosexuality. Because it gave us other examples! Thanks Bible. Sodom is presented as a society defined by pride, wealth without mercy, hostility towards the masses, and attempted sexual violence. That is far more specific and a bit more disturbing than some men were gay. What about Jude 7th? A traditional response is to quote Jude. Even as Sodom and Gomorrah, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth for an example. Jude 7, KJV. This is the strongest New Testament passage for arguing that Sodom's offense had a sexual component. And it clearly does describe sexual immorality. But once again, it doesn't establish that Jude is describing a loving relationship between two human beings of the same sex. The phrase translated strange flesh literally concerns flesh of another or different kind. In the immediate literary context, Jude has just referred to angels who abandoned their proper place. This creates a serious interpretive possibility where the people of Sodom pursued beings who weren't even human at all, didn't have sex, didn't have one, never heard of it. From the reader's perspective, Lot's guests are angels, so Jude may be condemning, that's a new one. Jude may be condemning. Okay. Jude may be condemning, thank God, an attempt to violate an angelic or transgressive boundary, not defining consensual homosexuality as the sin of Sodom. There is disagreement here, I'll give you that. Some traditional interpreters, homophobes, understand strange flesh as sexually unnatural desire more generally. Others understand it specifically means humans pursuing angelic beings. What Jude unquestionably adds is sexual transgression. What it doesn't add is a picture of an equal, consensual gay relationship between two loving people. The distinction still stands. Gang rape of supernatural visitors ain't gay marriage. I know it's very similar. It's just a mob of homosexuals, isn't it? I can't say that. There is another problem with casually saying Sodom and Gomorrah prove homosexuality is sinful. Genesis never gives us a matching scene in Gomorrah. The angels enter Sodom, the mob scene occurs in Sodom, Gomorrah and the other cities of the plain are destroyed alongside it because the regional society is presented as collectively corrupt. The text doesn't prescribe a separate episode. Prescribe. Oh, I need healing, doctor. Prescribe me a separate episode in which the inhabitants of Gomorrah engage in same-sex behavior. It doesn't do that. Genesis 19 later describes the destruction of the cities collectively. That doesn't mean Gomorrah was innocent. It means the phrase Sodom and Gomorrah cannot function as a precise citation proving a particular sexual rule. The narrative's accusation is far broader than that. Now, where their argument fails, because they're a fucky dum-dum, is their use of Sodom committing several reasoning errors. Firstly, false equivalence, treating attempted gang rape as equivalent to a consensual same-sex relationship. Secondly, context stripping. It removes the mob, coercion, threatened break-in, foreign status of the victims, abuse of hospitality, and broader accusation of injustice, preserving that was hard. Preserving only the fact that the attackers and intended victims were male. Third, it's very close to anachronism by importing the modern category of homosexuality, an enduring pattern of orientation and identity, into a narrative about collective sexual violence. Got to swallow, got some spit going on. Fourth, it engages in proof texting. The name of a biblical story is invoked as though merely mentioning it resolves a dispute without actually interpreting what happens in that story. And finally, it treats later cultural association as original text meaning. Because Sodom is later associated with same-sex acts in later Christian vocabulary, that association is assumed to be the obvious subject of Genesis itself, when it clearly isn't. But interpreting scripture means moving in the other direction. We begin with the text. How this affects our conversation? By invoking Sodom immediately, they change the subject. My initial claim concerned the translation and historical interpretation of passages that have been applied to homosexuality. Rather than addressing the language or history, they introduced a story whose relevance they assumed without explaining. That allowed the debate to proceed as though the following proposition had already been proven. Sodom was destroyed for homosexuality. But that proposition was precisely what needed to be demonstrated, not assumed. This is a form of begging the question, which makes you a cunt. The argument depends upon the conclusion it is supposed to establish. Trump does this a lot. So did Charlie Kirk. Once we actually read Genesis 18 and 19, compare them with Judges 19, and then read Ezekiel's own description of Sodom, the simplistic claim no longer survives. A sexual offence occurs in the story, but the offence is attempted gang rape. Inhospitality here means a prosperous society violently exploiting strangers and refusing protection to the vulnerable. Pride and social justice then occur. Social justice, injustice. Well, justice when God smites them, but it's different. Ezekiel explicitly names them. None of these passages depict, discuss, or condemn two gay people building a consensual, committed, and loving relationship. Conclusion. Was Sodom completely unrelated to sexual wrongdoing? No. That would overcorrect in the opposite direction. Genesis 19 very obviously involves threatened sexual violence, and Jude 7 remembers Sodom in connection with sexual immorality because of that. But does it establish that every same-sex relationship is sinful? Also no. The story contains no gay people, no mutual desire, no consent, no marriage, no lifelong companionship. What it contains is a mob of angry, violent men trying to rape a foreigner. And raping a concubine. Using that story to condemn modern gay relationships is like using the rape of the concubine to condemn heterosexual marriage, because this is what it stands for: rape. The sex of the intended victim does not define the moral nature of the crime. The violence, coercion, abuse of strangers, city's arrogance, and the refusal to defend the vulnerable does. And ironically, when Christians like her take a story about wealthy people abusing outsiders and turn it into a weapon against a against another vulnerable minority, we risk repeating the precise moral failure that Ezekiel identifies: pride without mercy, religious certainty without injustice, with injustice, and power used against people who need protection. This has been my TED Talk. I love ya.